All right, Christopher, you're up, my
Hi,
love.
thank you, Donna. Hey, everyone. Again, I'm Christopher Brown. I'm a certified sex therapist and psychotherapist, a clinical social worker for over 20 years now. And when we start talking about attachment theory, one of the reasons that Andrea and I wanted to bring this to her audience is in the pandemic, there's a book out there called Attached, and Attached had been published pre-pandemic, but it soared back up the bestseller list in self-help during the pandemic. And it was one of these things that, and we're all sort of curating our feeds these days, whether we're on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. And attachment theory in the circles that I kind of follow sort of got this traction where it broke through into popular culture. And one of the things as a psychotherapist that I have mixed feelings about it. I'm ambivalent about it, which, and if you're not familiar with ambivalent, it's the emotional experience of being pulled in opposite directions, right? So I often think of ambivalence as indifference. It's not at all. I feel strongly in two opposing directions, right? Which is a preview of my attachment style. And we'll get to that. So when you feel strongly in two directions in this way, I found myself as a psychotherapist going, oh no, we're taking a very nuanced school of psychology, a lens, if you will. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. And we're trying to apply it to our general lives as if we kind of know what this all means. And so we get it. If you think about a reel or you think about a post, you're getting snippets of what is a larger theory that people like me go to school for a long time to figure out how to use. So, on the one hand, I'm glad we're talking about this stuff because attachment theory of all of the five psychologies, and I'll tell you what those lenses are. Um, of all the five psychologies, it's the most relevant, in my opinion, through the lifespan. So, I'm glad we're talking about it. And I'm worried about how we talk about it in these short little bites where we think, oh, okay, I'm getting the whole picture by seeing a few really good experts weigh in these bite-sized chunks. So I'm on the one hand, I'm scared of that because we're going to minimize something that's not super complicated, but pretty nuanced. But I'm really glad we're talking about it, right? So think about that ambivalence, right? And so what I'd ask of you is as I drop these nuggets for you, try to just jot down a couple of things on your phone, on a notepad, in your mind about what stands out to you. We've got a small enough group today to where we can talk about whatever resonates with you, whether we're talking about existential shift, like going from a working life to a retirement, or starting a new relationship, or trying to figure out how to apply a brand new theory to my personal situation. Any of this that resonates with you, make a note, and we'll have time today for you to ask specific follow-up questions. So let me jump into the five psychologies. The first one that I use as a psychotherapist, and it's the first one we came with. So goes back to Sigmund Freud, who is now in sort of our retrospection, a complicated figure to say the least, especially as a sex therapist. There are things and theories that he said that are drenched in misogyny and really problematic sexual health. And he was the first guru that I know in the West who encouraged us to think about our internal worlds, right? And he was prolific and he spawned so many students. Remember, and still to this day, an apprentice model. So many people that will talk about learned under the big umbrella of Sigmund Freud, and he talked about drive theory. So, in a nutshell, drive theory is Sigmund believed, and remember, he was a neurologist. Psychiatry didn't exist in his day. He was a neurologist, but he would see these patients walking into his office, and they would be manifesting physical symptoms like blindness or paralysis, for which there was no physical cause that he could determine. So he believed that unconsciously there were conflicts within that were driving physical symptoms. So from the beginning of my business, which is called the Talking Cure, psychotherapy, we have believed that there is a mind-body connection. We now have the science to know that is in fact true, and Andrea can tell you a whole lot about the mind-body connection. But it's we get more and more of the science to prove what we've intuitively known all this time. Our buddy Sigmund, he believed that these conflicts boil down to one of two things. It's either about anger or it's about sex. right? So we have conflicting feelings about our own anger. We have conflicting feelings about our own sexual urges. And those sublimations, those suppressions, stuffing it down, caused this physical dysfunction like blindness or muteness, right? Like I can't say it, right? So you kind of see how drive theory sort of works. But is everything about anger and sex? It's probably a lot, but it's probably not all. So along comes ego psychology. And ego psychology is based on the idea, this is the second psychology. So think of these as lenses. You can look at your life, you can look at your situation. I would look at a client's situation through one of these lenses, depending on what fits best for them. Ego psychology is based on the premise that life is hard. I have a specialty in anxiety disorders. I tell my anxious folks, please don't borrow trouble. Life is hard enough, right? Mortality alone, living in large systems that are biased, that are misogynistic, or that are racist in a systemic way at a high level, living in poverty, right? Mortality, right? The fear of abandonment in childhood. We're going to get back to that one with attachment, y'all. So preview, but these problems are big enough on their own. So don't borrow any trouble, I say to my anxious folks. We do it anyway. I'm also an anxious person. So we borrow the trouble, but the work is then how do I let that go and just have real life experience? Ego psychology believes that we all develop ways of coping with a difficult life and that there are a range of coping mechanisms from very primitive to very mature. I'm very proud to say that humor is thought of as one of the most mature defenses. Andrea may disagree, but I use humor quite a bit. At least I think it's funny. And I make myself laugh, which is kind of the point, right? In the face of great difficulty, can I laugh? When I'm thinking about a new relationship, when things get tough, can we laugh together? If not in the difficulty, pretty soon after the difficulty? If so, great sign. If not, okay, not a red flag, but maybe a yellow. Like, how do we try to find the humor in difficult situations? An example of more primitive would be blame, which we might call projection. We might call, there's all kinds of fancy, words. You've got to have enough letters after your name. You have to call it the fancy stuff. But I'll just break it down. I mean, you lie. You learn to lie. So those of you who are parents, if you have, there's a running joke with my parent, my parent clients that say, well, if you have one child, that doesn't really count because you always know who did it. But if you have two children and you come in and say, hey, who left the bike out in the Honolulu rain this morning? And you have, say a boy and a girl, and Johnny looks up and he says, Sarah. So we learn this kind of, if I can deflect, if I can project, right? It's not my fault, it's their fault. Right? It's one of the most basic defenses that we learn, right? So if I am dealing with an adult who has that basic defense, again, not red flag, but maybe a yellow flag, right? So I want to be careful. I want to be concerned. So that's ego psychology, right? Life is hard. We develop, a myriad of strategies to deal with it. They range in, sort of degrees of functionality, let's say, from primitive to mature. Okay, so now we're going to go to object relations. Object relations is tough because in the original German translation, the word object, when we say it in English, we think of objectification, particularly post Me Too, right? To call something an object feels bad. But the idea in the basic German translation, object means other. So the idea with object relations is that we carry a cast of characters around with us, inside of us. Both my parents have passed away, and yet I can conjure my mother at the drop of a hat. I can say, what would Natalie say to me in this situation? What advice would she give? And I can call her forth, right? We see this in relationships when unconsciously we start to turn our partners into a character from our internal cast. Or even worse, if we are starting to be turned into a character from their cast. My great mentor, Esther Perel, says relationships are often situations where we are cast into roles for which we did not audition. Okay, so that's object relations at play. Again, object is not objectification, object is other. right? So when I react to you as if, right? That's how, when I'm working with a couple, I'm always looking like, how are they reacting? Are they reacting to each other as the grown adults they are, the sexy, vibrant, juicy people they are? Or are they reacting to them more like they react to their kids, more like they reacted to their parents, right? So that's object relations. That's that lens. Finally, we've got self-psychology. This is the fourth lens. Self-psychology is just what it sounds like. Having a good, solid view, accurate view of myself in the world and how I relate to other people is self-psychology. This is one I struggle with. Andrea knows this about me. I don't have a good, clear self-image. I don't know what does that mean? I don't know what I look like in the world, y'all. Like the selfie has helped me a ton because I can take these pictures of myself and, oh, I look like that. I joked earlier about my silver hair. I still see myself as having all black hair. It was quite a thing when I had to go in for my new driver's license and put my hair color down. So again, self-psychology is that experience of getting an accurate read of oneself, right? So those are the four lenses. Now we're going to get to it. Attachment theory. It's the fifth psychology that we use in my business. It's based in, as all of these theories are, this is important to remember. It was originally based as a theory of child development. Child development. Okay, so, and I need to credit Mary Ainsworth, who did the strange situation experiments, and John Bowlby, who originated the concept. Bowlby, remember how I said everything goes back to our buddy Sigmund? So Bowlby is a psychoanalyst. I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I'm kind of neo-Freudian in my training at a base level. All of us that are thinking about this stuff and writing academic papers for our own benefit branch off in some way from that tree that started with Sigmund. Bowlby was no different, but he came up with a different idea. Remember, pure psychoanalytic folks, they think everything's about drive. They think everything's about sex. They think everything's about anger. Well, Bowlby started to wonder, what about little kids that have to attach to their caregivers or else they die? Y'all, I'm not joking. Like when I say to my anxious people, like, don't borrow trouble, life's hard enough. Think about those who are parents out there or those who know little kids. Like, think about the babies you know in your life or your family or your extended family. If they were truly abandoned, not to be overly dramatic, y'all, but we don't survive. Right? So that is one of the key things I want you to know about attachment in childhood. It is about survival. Really, at a fundamental level, we had to attach this way, whatever way that is, and we'll get into what that means. We had to attach this way or we weren't going to make it. Right? So with attachment theory, think about that at a core level. So Bowlby comes in, he comes up with this idea. Mary Ainsworth designs this experiment, which basically temporarily separated children from mothers. Then the mothers came back and she observed the children's reactions, right? And so that gave us the basic attachment styles, going back to like the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Which I use this terminology. This is one of the things we can talk about. There are a lot of people trying to rebrand these words that Bowlby and Ainsworth came up with because some of them don't sound super great. Remember when I said at the beginning I was ambivalent? Like on the one hand, I'm glad we're talking about attachment theory, but if I walked up to you and said, wow, now keep in mind I got all these letters after my name, and I say, wow, you sure having a disorganized attachment style. Disorganized. How great does that sound? Somebody comes up to you today and says, hey, I couldn't help but notice how disorganized you are. I mean, right? It doesn't sound great. So again, as this, theory becomes more and more pop culture, we're like, well, we don't want to call anybody disorganized, so we're going to call them something else. Right. And so there's a proliferation of language around this stuff. It updates about every 2 years. So I'm using language that's the original stuff, but it's old. So there are a lot of different words out there that we can talk about and I can clarify for you what they mean. But think about attachment in this basic way. As children, I needed to form some kind of attachment to those big adults around me or I wasn't going to survive. Depending on the kids, depending on the parents rather, or the parent figures, I could attach as a child securely or insecurely. Those are the two basic parts, right? Now, within insecure attachment, there are a couple of different types. There is anxious And anxious in this context, remember, I work with anxiety disorders. So this is where, again, the word doesn't quite mean what we think it means. We think of anxious, or I think of anxious as like generalized anxiety disorder or an OCD or a social phobia or all this kind of stuff. That's not what anxious means in this context. Think about anxious as worried, right? I'm worried. And this is where I'm going to get into some of my self-disclosure, right? So we get into insecure. Remember, there's secure attachment, and secure attachment and you'll see it, like you go out to a restaurant where there are a bunch of families and you'll see evidence of secure attachment, right? So an example would be a parent walking with a kid, or at least looks like a parent, an adult figure, got him by the hand, and the kid runs off. Kid runs off and explores the world, right? That's part of what attachment is in childhood. Remember, baseline, it's about survival, but also the kids want to go and they want to learn. But if they get too far away, that kid runs too far away, you're going to watch them. They'll turn back. They'll do this. And they'll say, is mom still there? Is dad still there? Is my trusted adult still there? And they'll see him and they'll keep running, right? And so they'll explore farther. So in secure attachment, to really feel safe, right? Well, really in any attachment. So that's another thing. But in secure attachment, it's about survival. It's about exploring the world from a secure base, right? When that kid looks back on the sidewalk, it's looking back to see if the secure home base is still there, right? And then they're exploring farther in the world. Okay, so that's secure attachment. Insecure attachment, remember we talked about anxious, I'm worried, right? This is where I come in a little bit. So in my family went through a massive divorce, which we would call now an attachment trauma. So basically a bomb went off in my family of origin when I was about 5 years old. And older brother, older sister, dad all left, right? And I think about that event from like my view as an adult now, but I sometimes spend some time, like when I see a 5-year-old, I think, oh, I was that age when every adult in my family except my mom went away. Now I was left at 5 with a mom who was a drunk. And anybody who knows somebody who uses substances a ton and abuses them knows they're intermittently available. So what did a smart little boy learn to do? To monitor, to watch, to worry. Is she available? Is she there? Is she present? Right? Now, this is where the insecure attachment style comes in. Anxious type, right? I start to worry about her and worry about me. Am I safe in the world? Right? So that's an example of insecure attachment. The other one, I've got illustrations of both within me, so it's great, is avoidant, right? So I had one of these shared custody situations. So my parents would put me on a plane, literally with my little tote bag, and put me on a plane. They'd send me back and forth to each other. And the man that my mom would send me to, my dad, was this bully of a man who was a rager, explosive, right? Scary as hell. So, I mean, to grown people, much less a 5-year-old. So what did a clever little boy learn to do? Avoid him at all costs. Yes, exactly. Andrea just covered her face, right? Like, I don't even want to see him. Oh, okay. So yeah, to survive, I got to be a small target for him, right? So when I was with dad, I was avoidant. When I was with mom, I was worried, I was anxious, right? Both insecure attachments, but what I needed to do to survive. Well, in attachment theory, we call the combo of insecure attachment, anxious and avoidant, disorganized. Again, so I come up to people and I say, hey, I couldn't help but notice your disorganized attachment style. I mean, that's not a great pickup line. Well, it kind of worked out for me, but that's a whole different story. So this is where I want to say, and Tara will remember this from the first workshop probably, attachment style is not fixed. It is contextual. I am not afraid. Remember that book Attached I talked about that shot up the bestseller list? I read it in preparation for our first workshop. And one of the things I was really alarmed about is that book really demonizes the avoidant attachment style, folks. There is nothing about attachment style that scares me. If I'm in a new relationship and I start to recognize somebody is insecurely attached and they're either anxious or avoidant or, like me, a combination and disorganized, I'm not scared of that at all. This is just what they had to do to survive the family they came from, right? What does scare me in new relationships is if someone has an allergy to personal responsibility, meaning I'm not willing to look at myself. You hear me in the evidence of my therapy. Remember, I became a therapist because my therapist was a clinical social worker. This was a lot of what we were working on, is really giving myself grace that, yeah, in adult relationships, having an avoidant or a disorganized attachment style wasn't working out too great for me, but it helped me survive my childhood, right? So the first thing I had to do was forgive myself for being the way I was, for adapting the way I had to survive. Then I realized, and Andrea and I, after this workshop, are going to send y'all a copy of our assessment to define your attachment styles. Attachment styles are contextual. When I took our assessment, I show up and it asks for 4 key relationships. And in my case, I did partner, that's Andrea, best friend, a guy I've known since I was 4. He's the brother of my choosing. We're going to, be together for the rest of our lives. And then mom and dad. With dad, of course, I was avoidant, right? The ragers, stay away, be a small target. With mom, I was worried. She was drunk a lot. She wasn't available a lot. I had to, get what I could when I could. So I needed to constantly be monitoring, taking her temperature. So I was anxious with mom. With best friend, securely attached. With partner, securely attached. So y'all, attachment styles are not genetically coded. They are varied. Okay. So that's what I really want you to take away. Remember, it starts as a childhood development theory, right? Where we want children to survive. We want them to have a secure base, and we want them to be able to explore the world from that secure base. Now, with me, with a disorganized attachment style, I'm going to move into adulthood. The job of attachment theory, or the job of attachment style in adulthood, is to form a secure attachment, not with best friend, like I have, not with my love, like I have, but with myself. Oh, oh. Now that's been a little bit longer coming, y'all, if I'm going to be honest. It has taken me a while to form a secure attachment with myself. So I didn't say this in my intro, but I have a license in Colorado. I have a license in Texas. I come from the deep south of the continental U.S. And I'm sitting here in Honolulu, Hawaii, doing this workshop with you. I hadn't been farther west in the U.S. than an occasional trip to California to visit my best friend, that guy I knew since I was 4, because I could never get too far away from my home base, which was in Southwest Louisiana and in East Texas. I never got too far away. So how in the world did I fall in love and fly across an ocean to see this woman who is teaching you today? I couldn't have done it if I didn't form a secure attachment, not to her, not to my best friend, but to myself. Okay. So that's the key. So in relationships, and I heard several of you asking questions about relationships, and we're going to talk a lot about connection. If you tune into Andrea's content, it's going to be a lot about connection, sexual connection, intimate connection, emotional connection, communication skills, all that stuff. Look, I'm a relationship therapist, a sex therapist. We talk a ton about connection. What we don't talk about is differentiation. It's the flip side of the coin, right? So to have a really rock star relationship, you've got to be able to attach, and you've got to be able to differentiate. I have to still be me while I travel across the ocean to see her. Because that's what happens a lot in long-term relationships, is we get this enmeshed, right? If you see couples been together a long time, they always talk we all over themselves. You're talking about enmeshment. They have lost differentiation, right? If you get couples that are together all the time and they're always talking about I, okay, they got the differentiation thing. Check that box, great. You probably don't have the connection piece, right? So we've got to be able to vacillate between both. So that's the goal in adulthood, right? So it's secure attachment to yourself, so you can form connection with adult other and still be yourself. Okay. Looking down at my notes here to see what I've missed. We've got a couple of things that I just want to touch on. One is attachment trauma. I talked about the bomb that went off in my family, attachment trauma. Here's the downside. I'm a good example. I think I'm an optimistic example of attachment changing from really disorganized and insecure in childhood to secure in adulthood. Realistically, it can go the other way, right? So I can come from a very secure attachment, right, background, and I can get into an abusive relationship, let's say, and I can experience interpersonal violence in that relationship. I can experience gaslighting, which is a type of emotional abuse. I can experience coercive control. I can go through a really terrible divorce. I'm trying to think of attachment traumas that I've seen in practice. I've had parents come to me after the death of a child. I've had people come in after selling a business, a family business, and not knowing who they were. Kind of self-psychology there, right? Like, I don't know who I am without this work. All of these can be attachment traumas, right? So it can shift us from we once were secure, but we go through a really painful situation and we become insecure, right? And we become insecure rightly because we've been through a really, really hard situation, right? It's not because we're inherently flawed. No, again, remember, we still have that coding, those neural networks firing that wanted us to attach to survive. So attachment theory, even though in adulthood, remember, attachment to self, so I can differentiate, so I can be myself in close proximity to other, right? So then I can connect and then go back to being me. Think of the sexual metaphor there, right? To have really great sex, I've got to go into other and then I've got to come back into me, right? It's the same idea. And after a traumatic experience, can I really need to go back and have what we call in my business corrective emotional experience? So that we can get back to, or in my case, for the first time, experience what it is to be safe and to be myself in a relationship? Yes, yes. This is where this is the job of psychotherapy, in my opinion. Psychotherapy is designed to be a safe relationship that ends. It doesn't go on forever, but it allows you to have a secure base within yourself so you can go off and live your life. One note before I wrap up, and then I'll hand to Andrea. If you ever run across someone who is neurodivergent, this is autistic spectrum disorders, and we're also sort of folding now in my world ADHD and into neurodivergent sort of brains. In those situations, attachment styles tend to be a little bit more fixed, but short of neurodivergence, short of autistic spectrum disorders, these attachment styles are malleable either way. So it's one of the most helpful psychologies, one of the most hopeful psychologies that I use in my practice. And I'm very happy to lead any sort of discussion that we have later about the topic. So with that, thank you for your time and attention. Andrea, I'll hand it back to you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Christopher. I wanted to add a little bit of my own disclosure into this as well and say that I too have a fairly disorganized style. My mom was kind of a high functioning alcoholic and very emotionally avoidant. And so I too learned to kind of walk on eggshells. How is she feeling? Is she going to not talk to me today? Is she going to talk to me today? And my dad never really stood up for me, right? So we see how that plays out. Well, I see how that plays out in both my relationship with them today. They are both still living, but I don't feel close to them because even as a child, I wasn't able to trust them with my feelings, my experiences, what was really happening in my life, my sexuality, my relationships. And that distance that I feel with my parents has then recreated itself multiple times in various relationships. And one of the things Christopher said really early in when he was talking, which I loved, is that he's not, because it's malleable, because attachment style is malleable, it doesn't really matter what the other person has as long as they take responsibility. And so one of the things he said at the last workshop was, oh yeah, I saw Andrea's disorganized attachment coming from a mile away. But I also saw that because of the therapy I've done and the work that I've done, that I'm able to take responsibility for that and say, ooh, I'm really feeling overwhelmed. Like I really need a day apart or something like that. And so it's been really joyful work to be able to work on this in real time with two disorganized people in a long distance relationship. That wasn't really specified, but I live here in Honolulu and have for 20 years. He and I met at an event in New York, and he lives in Texas and Colorado. So we have built a secure relationship over this past year through long distance, through doing this work. And the corrective emotional experiences that he talks about have really been so powerful. And just to give you some examples of what that looks like, knowing that I have had insecure attachment in the past, both anxious and avoidant, right? This disorganized style, he reminds me that I love you and you are free. This relationship is a place for you to be, all of you. And also, it is not a cage, it is not a trap, you are not required. Um, and he can preempt a lot of the challenges that I have that I am still very actively working on by saying, like, what do you need today? Like, do you need time apart? Um, and here's a very brief example of this. We were on vacation for the past 2 weeks, and I realized so he's training for this marathon, right? And I realized I was like, well, when are you going running? Like, how long do you need to run for tomorrow? Like, maybe you could go in the morning. I was like, oh, I'm trying to create space for myself by supporting his run, which is a genuine support. Of course, I want him to be supported in his training, but also I need time to myself. Okay, great. This is information. How do I then articulate it as my own need and not as this kind of like backdoor controlling, trying to manage his schedule, instead just saying like, hey, I really need some alone time today. Maybe that dovetails with your run, maybe it doesn't. How do we figure this out, right? So that happened literally a week ago. So we still are, working with so much of this stuff. And it's very live, and it's these corrective emotional experiences of both realizing my own stuff and also having him say, like, do you need time? Do you need space? Like, what do you need? What do you need to hear from me right now to feel, etc.? Did you want to add something, Christopher?
Yes, thank you. And Andrea, what a lovely example. And so just to add to that, and this is something for all of us to remember. My baseline attachment style will always be disorganized.
Mm.
Right? Remember, it's a childhood survival mechanism. Like I said, we have enough science now, we've done enough brain imaging to actually see the neural networks involved. We're actually starting to map some of the genes that are involved in genetic in attachment. So it's getting more and more clear that when in that example, when she says, "Hey, I need space from you today," remember, my disorganized style is what I needed to survive my childhood. So my emotional knee jerk reaction is going to be a cognitive one. It's going to be a thought, and it's going to be, what did I do wrong? Right? Because remember, little kids, they're little narcissists. They think everything in the world is their fault. Right? Yeah, and there are just a ton of examples from my childhood. We've all got them. I mean, like if we spend enough time, I could find an example for each one of you where it's like, mom and dad had a fight and it's because I didn't clean my room, like they said, right? It's going to be that kind of thing. And kids make those associations. So when she asks for that space, my immediate reaction is going to be, what did I do wrong? Now, my work as a grown up who is actually securely attached is not to respond to that first impulse within me, right? Is to be able to take a breath, pause, build some space between her ask, which is an important, genuine ask that she is being damn courageous to articulate, right? You think that backdoor thing she did, she came up with on purpose? Hell no. She figured that out in her childhood. I better not ask for what I need because I'm gonna get punished, right? In some way, or somebody's gonna withdraw their love from me. And again, remember, as kids, if the big ones withdraw their love and go away, we don't make it. Right. I mean, that's how fundamental this stuff is. So she didn't come by that backward communication by accident. That's a clever little girl who figured that out. Not so helpful in an adult relationship, but really important to recognize that she's not trying to manipulate me. She's trying to get her needs met the best way, the first way she knew how. right? So she's got to make the ask. I've got to hold my response. I've got to breathe. Remember the differentiation. This is where we each got to be our own individuals so we can come together to meet each other's needs. Right. So it's a beautiful example how as adults we can do this work, but as kids, we don't have the bandwidth to do stuff like that. Okay. Andrea, thank you.
Hmm. So, as we were conceptualizing this first workshop and then moving this into the second workshop, one of the things we really wanted to integrate was, okay, great. I'm the sex coach. How does this work with sex and, more intimate connections? And it kind of goes back to that running example, right? If I know that I want a certain type of play, a certain type of pleasure, I might not be able to ask for that directly. If I really just don't want to have sex tonight but I do really need cuddles, if I'm securely attached and have all my wits about me and I'm in a secure place, I can say to my love, "Hey, I know we talked about making love tonight. I'm actually feeling really tired. Can we cuddle instead? Because I do want the connection. I do want the intimacy and the closeness, but I don't have the time, space, energy, physicality to make love in whatever way we decide to do that." That's great. But if I'm anxiously attached to my person, am I going to be able to ask for what I really want? Maybe sometimes, maybe other times, no. Because if we are anxiously connected to our person, if we are afraid our person will leave when we ask for what we want, it's going to inhibit what we can ask for within our playtime. It's going to inhibit what we allow ourselves to experience, right? I work with a lot of individuals and couples to really bring more mindfulness into the bedroom. How am I feeling? What is happening in my body in this moment? Where does my brain go and how do I bring it back, right? If I am constantly doing that monitoring that he was monitoring, is this person okay? Is this okay? Am I doing this right? Did I do something wrong? I'm not going to be in my body. I'm going to be with the other person. And if I'm with the other person, not only am I most likely experiencing less pleasure, I'm also perhaps not being my true self, right? If I really want to if I really want to get on top and that's something that it feels really interesting and craving, I'm really craving this in the moment, but I'm afraid my partner's going to think I'm being too bossy, too needy, too something, I'm probably not going to do it. And then over the long term, that can build resentment, and that resentment can be super corrosive if we're not addressing the needs in any specific moment, in any specific relationship. Similar with disorganized, if I really want closeness, intimacy in this case, not necessarily sex, but that also kind of scares me. How might I engage with my person, or knowing that they're avoidant and that if I get too close, it might scare them away. I might use that backdoor method to say like, "Hey, like," this was the example we used in the other workshop, like, "Hey, if you're available and you wanna talk, like, that might be good, like, I have some time, like, maybe if you need to talk, we can talk today." And instead of saying like, "Hey, like, I need you, I really need to talk," and trusting that he's gonna hear that as a need and not pull away from me, not feel like I'm asking for too much. Like these are just some of the ways that these kind of insecure attachments can move through our sexual and intimate relationships kind of in the day to day. And you can see, hopefully, from these kind of two small examples, how that plays out in a lot of sexual relationships where if we don't feel secure, if we don't feel like we can trust our partner to be there and to hear us and love us as an individual person, as a differentiated person, how are we ever going to ask to try out that new kinky thing that we read about on Instagram? Are we ever going to feel secure enough to push our own boundaries in a way that allows me to explore my own sexuality within the context of our relationship? So that's just a bit of an overview about kind of how this works. And when we are securely attached, I really think we have a better opportunity to maintain our boundaries and also explore our edges. And so just some brief definitions on that. We can use boundaries in a sexual context and also in a non-sexual context, right? Like I have a boundary that my boss cannot call me after 5 p.m. on a weekday. That's a boundary. I can also have a boundary to say that my partner doesn't sleep with other people, right? And we can have limits or edges within sexual play, right? My partner and I have agreed to do a specific activity, and this feels a little scary, but I trust them and they trust me to say what I need. Okay, so now we're at this edge, we're at this limit. And I heard this great definition of this a few months ago on a podcast, where an edge is where we're feeling a little bit of like, oh, this is new or scary, but I can still self-regulate using breath, using connection with my person, connection with myself. When there's been a crossing, when there's been a boundary crossing or an edge, we've gone over the edge, we can't self-regulate. So as you think about your own play and experimentation within sex and sexuality, can you maintain your sense of self? Can you maintain your breath? Can you feel into that kind of learning edge, that scary edge? And does it still work within the boundaries that you've created? So with that, well, I want to, Christopher, do you want to add anything to that before we jump into the kind of roundtable discussion, if you will?
The only things that came up are just supportive, and I mean, you're really nailing it. And I think for everybody going around, when your introductions, you each kind of gave, situations going on in your life that sort of perked my, psychotherapy radar for attachment issues. Right? Is there, it's, do I know myself? Do I know my partner? Am I going through a relationship trauma? Am I, or an attachment trauma rather? Am I recovering? Am I going through an existential crisis in my own life, right? Which may cause me to withdraw. How well do I know how that's impacting me? How does that impact how I show up with my partner? Have I narrated that to them, right? I mean, all of this stuff, it's really useful once you can decode the jargon, right? And Andrea has given you some beautiful examples from our lives, and we're happy to share more. But I think it's important to, open it up to you and to situations in your lives if you want. This is not a requirement, but it is an opportunity. And feel free to take advantage of it or feel free to pass. What I say to my clients when I do this kind of work is I only have two rules in therapy. One is please take care of yourself, well water yourself, get good sleep, make sure you're warm and comfortable. And also, just because a therapist asks you a question, or anybody else for that matter, does not mean you have to answer. So, with rule number two firmly in mind, we'd like to open it up for any situations going on in your lives that you want some feedback on or you want to talk about. And then, Andrea, I know as a contingency, we talked about playing a game, and I don't have those prompts in front of me. I just want you to know. So, we may have to switch up the
Yep.
tech for.
No problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording portion of it. So you can feel free to be on camera to ask questions within this group here. And again, this is based on when we had the last workshop, people listened to Christopher's lecture, they listened to some of our examples and communications around that. And then they had very specific questions that we just couldn't have conceptualized building the workshop. So we want to be sure to open it up to you. And again, if there's no questions, or if we run out of questions, we're here until we have another 28 minutes. We will be here and we can have some prompts where we can do a little bit of kind of seeding the conversation. And what that looks like is I'll be sharing some phrases with you and you can say, does this fit with me? How might this fit with me? But again, it's open to you. So I'm going to stop the recording right now.